famous CHAZAL that says that when a person learns Torah, all sorts of bracha comes to the world, like diseases are prevented, people get tzedakah and they're protected from wars, that kind of thing. But how do we know that? It's kind of an unfalsifiable thing, right?
Well, how does CHAZAL know that? You mean, or how come it doesn't? How come it doesn't seem to happen all the time?
I mean, it seems it's impossible to prove, right? Because and not only that, but we can't deny our eyes. I mean, there are people who do learn Torah, and nevertheless, they have tremendous hardship in their own life,
right.
And even in the rest of the world also.
Yeah, this is a difficulty with a lot of things that our Chachamim teach us. It's not just this particular example. For example, I always get these questions about, Chazal say if you give Meiser, you're going to get rich. So and you're allowed to test Hashem. So everybody says, I'm going to give Meiser, I want to be rich. And the answer is very, very pashut. There's no guarantee you're going to be rich. I'll tell you that right now. So people then say, so what's going on? I mean, the Torah says it, Chazal say it, the Shulchan Aruch says it. So in what sense can it be said that these promises are true? Now, the question of how you know is less of a question. How I know is, in other words, if I wouldn't have proof, I would just say Chazal knew things that we don't know. But the question is not so much what's the proof. The question is that there seems to be proofs in the opposite direction. That's much more of a kasha. So let me just talk about Meiser for a moment. So there are a lot of different answers for why people who give Meiser, 10% of their income to tzedakah, don't become really rich. First of all, some say that the meaning of being rich is Somayach b'chelko. Pirkei Avos says, who is a wealthy person? Somayach b'chelko. So maybe the idea is Hashem will give you a bracha that you will be happy with what you have. A second idea is, what does it mean to be rich? Does it mean I'll be Bill Gates? What does the Torah say? You have to understand that even a lower middle class person today lives much, much more fancy than even wealthy people, some wealthy people in the past. So if you have bread and you have a house and you have electricity, you might be considered rich. The Torah doesn't guarantee you'll be a billionaire. Right? That's the second answer. But the third answer is where things get most complicated. And as Rav Chaim Kanievsky said this, and he's not the first one that said it, and that is, spiritual rules move in opposite directions, meaning there's one spiritual rule that says giving Meiser will give you wealth. But there are other spiritual rules that if you do certain aveiros, you'll get death or poverty. So when a person is dealing with spiritual forces that are moving in opposite directions, there's going to be a push and a pull. There's going to be a tug in one direction and a tug in another direction. So it may turn out that maybe the evil decree is stronger, but it'll still be less than it would have been because of the good force. Or maybe the good force will be stronger, but it'll be reduced a little bit because of the evil tug. Now, you can't look at things in isolation, meaning if the only thing you did in your life would give Meiser, maybe you would be Bill Gates. But that's not the only thing I do. I have other aveiros, I have other problems, and therefore you have to analyze all of these kochos kind of working with each other. Now, that does mean that things are not as guaranteed as you would assume. Now, the same thing is really true for Torah learning. Yes, Torah learning brings great, great blessing in the world. But first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll go to the learner. These might be blessings in the world. If a country didn't get blown up today, it may be because of the Torah learning. Now, you can't prove it, but Chazal say such a thing is a possibility. So that's one thing, that the promises are not necessarily to the person who learns. These are brachos that come to the world. And the second thing to keep in mind is that you have to balance the koach of Torah learning with other aveiros that are being done that pull in the opposite direction. Which means, again, it's unfortunate because that does mean that these rules are not as cut and dry and not as definitive as you would like. But the people that say, I'm just going to give Meiser and that's going to guarantee that I'll be a wealthy person, it doesn't work that way for the number of these reasons. So that would be the same type of approach there. Let me just point out that the one Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that does talk about the reward that you will get for learning Torah. And it mentions many, many brachas. It does not mention wealth. In other words, none of those brachas to the guy himself refer to material wealth. It'll say you'll be beloved by people, you'll be respected, you will have wisdom, right? So Einachinami, Lagabe, the person who learns, he may be very poor all of his life. And Fakert, he will get more reward for his learning because he's Moser Nefesh in his learning. The idea that the learning of Torah brings bracha is to the world. It's not necessarily to the person who is learning. Like the Gemara says about Rabbi Chanina ben Daisa. Chanina ben Daisa was a great, great tzaddik. And he lived very simply. He lived in great poverty. And the Gemara says, the whole world gets its parnasa in the merit of Chanina ben Daisa, but Chanina ben Daisa only lives on a small measure of dried carob, Me'erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos. So the bracha doesn't automatically, in Gashmias, the bracha does not necessarily go to the tzaddik. The tzaddik is a conduit to bring those brachas into the world. Yeah.
Does Hashem put us in situations where we are bound to fail no matter what?
Yeah, does Hashem put us in situations where we are bound to fail, no matter what? That's a very, very interesting, difficult question. The normal standard answer is no. And that's the famous idea that's been said by many, many sources, that if Hashem gives you a challenge, by definition, you're capable of surmounting it. Hashem will never give you a challenge that you're not able to surmount. That would be the standard answer. Nevertheless, in certain Sifrei Chasidus, Rav Tzadok and the like, and this was so controversial that in the early editions of Rav Tzadok's writings, this was taken out, this was censored, because the family thought it was too revolutionary. Rav Tzadok says that sometimes Hashem does give us a challenge in which it is inevitable we're going to fail. It's inevitable. And why does he do that? For different reasons. Part of it is to teach us humility. Part of it is to teach us an awareness of our limitations and the like. So Rav Tzadok does talk about the inevitability of failure, but he has a cautionary note that you have to be very, very careful not to give yourself a free pass with that type of argument, because you understand the problem here. If the idea is, Hashem cannot expect me to pass this, a person could rationalize that for all sorts of things. A person could say, I'm really, really tired this morning. Hashem does not expect me to go to morning Seder or to go to Shul. So after the fact, it may very well be, after everything was said and done, it may very well be this was an isayon that you could not have passed and you weren't expected to pass it. But that's only in hindsight. That's only in retrospect. As you confront a situation, you always have to try your hardest to see if you could pass it. And if you don't, then einachinami, perhaps you were set up for that failure. But as I say, this is a controversial idea because the conventional idea, so to speak, in Judaism was that there's always the capacity of passing it. Yeah.
Let's descend in. There are many times when the Torah, TEHILLIM, like in Halal and Aleinu, where we emphasize the lacking of non-Jews. For instance, we struggle and get scar, they struggle and they don't get scar. And in Aleinu, we say like their gods don't have any eyes or ears and they can't, right? They have eyes and ears, but they can't sense, whereas our God, we bend our knees about Hashem. So what's the point of emphasizing the negatives in others? To me, this comes across extremely negatively and self-righteous. Am I missing something?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. People ask me to repeat the question when I'm facing the camera. And that is, the question is that either in Tehillim or other places, because some of what you said are not from Tehillim, it's from a Siyum, is there seems to be a denigration of the non-Jew, such as the statement at the end of a Siyum, we work and they work, we toil and they toil, but we toil and get reward, and they toil and don't get reward. And then you have in Tehillim, their gods, small g gods, have eyes and don't see, and ears and don't hear, but our God is the one God, etc. And the question becomes, why is it necessary, so to speak, to denigrate other people. In fact, I often have said this in chinuch itself. When you're trying to raise your child, you shouldn't raise your child by putting down other people, whether they're non-Jews or maybe more commonly, unfortunately in our society, people often put down other Jews. They'll say, oh, these Jews are not religious and whatever it is. And that's not really a good method of chinuch, because chinuch shouldn't be by knocking and being mevatel other people. Chinuch should be talking about what it is that we have that's beautiful and precious. So I certainly understand the feeling of the questioner that why are you denigrating? However, now again, to go over every single example, it's impossible, but just to take the specific examples that were mentioned, note that when David HaMelech says, their gods have eyes and do not see, he's not really knocking the Goyim. He's knocking the belief system of the Goyim. Now that's a legitimate enterprise, meaning David HaMelech is trying to communicate how worthless idolatry and paganism is. That's not putting anybody down. Maybe the Goyim are not to blame because they weren't educated or whatever it is. So this is not a passage, I think, that is really anti-non-Jew. It's anti-belief systems that are nonsensical and potentially destructive. In fact, you could find many, many psukim in Tanakh that actually talk about the righteous non-Jews who will come in the times of Moshiach. Just the Navi Zechariah, I just happened to learn this pasuk a few days ago, in which 10 non-Jews will grab the coat of the corner of a Jew's garment and say, we want to go with you, for we have heard that Hashem is with you. And the Navi Yeshayahu talks about, based tefillah yikare l'chol ha'amim, that the HARA and the future temple will be a house of prayer for all the nations of the world. So I don't think the idea is to denigrate other people, but it's to denigrate belief systems that are, number one, destructive, number two, irrational, number three, immoral, and the like. But as I say, I'll repeat what I earlier point. Certainly in our pedagogy, we should not really knock people. In fact, even when you criticize, let's say, the Reform movement, you're not criticizing individual Jews. You know, an individual Jew might be Reformed because they never learned differently. They never had exposure to Jewish education. So people are what they are, and they could be good people, they could be fine people, they could be people of midos and character. I mean, they could be our own parents or whatever it would be. And, you know, we don't have to denigrate them. But there are belief systems that are not emes and that create kilkulim. And one is entitled and one is even obligated sometimes to show why those certain beliefs are erroneous and the like. So I think most of, not all, the truth is, since the questioner did not bring out all of the different verses, this answer may not explain all the different verses, but I will take advantage of the fact that I think I can explain the ones that he mentioned. Oh yes, and one other thing, the Siyam one is also very interesting. We work and they work. We work and we get reward, and they work and they don't get reward. So here, the way the Chafetz Chaim interprets it, it's not negative at all. It's really making a very important point. What does it mean, they work and they don't get reward? If a guy, builds a building, if a guy does something, he gets paid for it. In what way does he not get reward? So the Chafetz Chaim says the difference is this. Outside of Torah, if you work hard but you don't produce a result, you don't get paid for your labor, you only get paid for results. They work and they don't get reward. They get reward for what they accomplished. They don't get reward for the work they put into it. With Torah, it's exactly the opposite. That even if we learned a lot, we tried learning and we didn't remember it, we didn't understand it, we didn't know it, we didn't accomplish a lot, but Hashem rewards us for the effort. So that's not an insulting comparison. It's making a point that Hashem in His Rachamim gives the Ikar reward for Torah learning on the amelos, on the work rather than the final result. Yeah.
So in one of the footnotes of the article of Sir Sharon, I came across that Melech he called like the statutes of the Torah a song, and this was a mistake, and resulted in like death of
Yeah.
I was wondering, kind of a two-part question. What does that mean, like learning Torah as a song, causing what to pick up Torah? Is that like having a nigun when they do the kashrus and teretzim?
Yeah.
And then the second part is, if it was a mistake to call it a song, why would it be codified in the TEHILLIM?
Yeah, yeah. So the question here was that the Gemara says in Megillah that at one point David HaMelech calls the Torah a song. Zemiros hayu li chukecha, your laws were for me a song. And we find that David HaMelech was criticized for that. Oh, you dare call the Torah a song? And because of that, there were various deaths that happened when the Aron HaKodesh was being moved, and the like. So the question becomes, number one, what exactly is wrong with calling the Torah a song? First of all, let me remind you that the Torah itself calls itself a song. You didn't bring up that point, but that's true. In Shiras Hazinu, Kisvu lachem es hashira hazos. Write down the shir, right, of the Torah, which is the Rambam says that's the makor of the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. So the question is, what's wrong with calling the Torah a song? And number two, if it was wrong, then why did the Tehillim keep that pasuk in? That was a bad thing that David said. Why would we memorialize it, so to speak, as a permanent feature? The short answer, I think, was that David HaMelech Vadai meant something positive, meaning to say David HaMelech's thought and motivation was holy, elevated, and therefore it gets included in Tehillim because of the holy thought that he had. And that is, he considered the Torah to be a song. It was a source of joy, a source of creativity, a source of creation to God. And as you say, the Gemara says, if you learn Torah without a nigun, it's not good. You're supposed to learn Torah with a nigun. That's what it says. Of course, that reminds me, I remember when I was in ninth grade in Ner Yisrael. Again, this is totally irrelevant, but it's a cute story. So we had some older chavrusas, etc., and one of them was a big shtick maker. He was really, really big shtick. So he started singing out loud, because he was supposed to sing some like rock song or something that he knew that the Rebbe would not be familiar with. So when the Rebbe went over to him and said, where did that music come from? So the guy said, this is an old Hasidic nigun. So the Rebbe said, very, very good. It's very inspiring. And keep it. Now that wouldn't work with the Somayach Rebbes who are more into popular culture, but at least the old Ner Yisrael Rebbes were not into it. But there is a concept of singing while you're learning, etc. So it's good, right? So if it's good, so why is it bad, right? So why was David criticized? Because David is criticized not so much for what he meant, but for the erroneous implications that some people might draw from what he meant. And that is, you call something a song, so there's a certain casualness about it. Meaning, like, I sing it when I feel like it, and when I don't feel like it, I don't sing it. I can take it for granted. I can take it or leave it. And that was kind of a disrespectful implication, because Torah is something you have to stay with. And even when you're not inspired, and even when you don't feel like singing it, you kind of stay with it. So I think what happened here is that a great tzaddik will be held to account by Hashem, not only for an improper kavanah that he had, but for the negative implications that some people might erroneously draw from that word. So in other words, the Torah being a song is a good thing, but it potentially could be a bad thing, and therefore David is held accountable for the consequence, the conclusions that people drew. Yeah.
What was then the Torah's positive? What's the perush? What's the Rashi perush on the Torah calling itself a song? What's the positive side of that?
What's the positivity of a song?
What's the perush of the Torah calling
So the positivity of Shira is the idea of, number one, the simcha that you have in it. Number two, the Netziv says a very interesting thing. Shira actually does not mean song. Shira actually means poetry. Right? It's not necessarily musical. And the Netziv says the characteristic of poetry is that it has a primary meaning, but many, many secondary meanings. Like a certain word is used which tells you one thing, but it's merames to other little things. He says that is the getter of the Torah, in which there's a pshat in the Torah, but then there are many, many remazim. So shira is a connotation of the shivim panim la Torah. Now, I do want to point out, just for accuracy here, that lamaisa, the term that the Torah uses to describe itself is shira. The term that David HaMelech used was zemiros. David did not use the word shira. Now, the truth is, shira is lav dafka musical. Zemiros, I think, is dafka musical. So there is a difference in the usage of song that David used versus poetry, which is the way the Torah described it. So that's something to think about. Why would there be a difference? Yeah, in the back.
Can a Kohen get a transplant?
Can a Kohen get an organ transplant?
Organ transplant, tissue transplant.
Yeah, an organ or... Yeah. Because the issue would be this, right? A Kohen is not allowed, even today, to become tameh to a dead body. And that includes parts of a body, etc. So the question is, when the Kohen is getting the transplantation of an organ, so you basically have something that's dead, or something that's cut off from a dead body, or removed from a dead body, that is making the Kohen comes in contact. Now, once it is attached to the Kohen, once the transplant is done, it's a davar pashut that the organ is no longer considered dead, and there's no problem there. But the problem is, obviously, there's going to be a touching before there's going to be a completion. And then the shaila would be, is it going to be usher? So it's a very good question. We would start off that it is usher, but in many cases of organ transplants, there's an obvious issue of pikuach nefesh. If a Kohen needs a heart transplant, right, that means he's in a matzav where he is almost certainly going to die without the transplant. So any type of transplant which is necessary for pikuach nefesh, for sure a Kohen can do. Now that raises interesting questions. Okay, so we got it. Most vital organs, actually all vital organs, are pikuach nefesh situations. Heart, liver, lung, kidney. Those are pikuach nefesh situations for sure. But one common transplant may not be a pikuach nefesh, and that's take a cornea. They have cornea transplants that can sometimes help a person with cataracts and the like, and that is l'chayra a non-life-threatening situation. Would that be permitted? But even here we have psukim. We have psukim that, number one, the Gemara says, an iver chashuv kameis, a blind person is considered to be like a dead person because he's exposed to many dangers. So I know Rav Wunderman did paskin. He was chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael in the late 60s and 70s, that we do consider even corneal transplants pikuach nefesh, and the same thing would be true for skin grafts for burn victims. But it may very well be true that if you're dealing with cosmetic surgeries, of course most men don't have cosmetic surgery. Remember, a bas Kohen has no issur of tumah anyway, so that's not a problem. But if a Kohen wanted to have some totally cosmetic type of procedure that would involve a dead organ, ein chinami, there would indeed be an issur in that type of situation. Yeah.
I mean, we know that there's a concept of psychological momentum. So let's say I do something that's hard once, it makes us stronger, it makes doing something else that's hard easier the second time, and it allows you to do more hard things. So for example, let's say it's difficult for me to, I'm feeling really tired, and let's say I still push through and learn or go to work anyway. It makes it easier for me to go to work or learn next time in the future when I'm tired, because it builds that habit, it builds the neurological pathways the more times I do it. But also, humans are not robots. We need rest at some point. We don't want to get burned out. So how do we know, let's say someone is feeling like really tired, just in a really bad mood, whether resting will be something that's beneficial, that will develop those neural pathways to allow them to keep doing hard things, to make hard things easier in the future, or whether that would be something negative and cause him to start like a new cycle where he gives himself more heterim to take it easy in the future.
Right. So this is really a very, very good question. A person is confronted with exhaustion or whatever fatigue, and the question is, if he keeps on persevering, that creates like a neural pathway that will make it easier for him the next time. And therefore the message should be, it's very hard for you to keep on going, but get through this and you'll be easier tomorrow. Or, as you say, we are not machines, and sometimes we genuinely need to take a break. We genuinely need to take a rest. So the question becomes, when is it legitimate to say, I need the rest, I need the break? And when is it maybe an evasion of responsibility because you're not pushing yourself as hard as you should push yourself? And that's a question that pertains to many aspects of religious life. When are you pushing yourself too hard? And when are you not pushing yourself enough? That's always going to be a very, very, very difficult issue. One of the great Gedolim that had been a Rosh Yeshiva of Somayach for a while, although he had his own yeshiva as well, was Rav Dov Schwartzman, Zichrono Livracha. His picture is in the office. Great, great man, a Ramashai Gadol B'Torah. In fact, Rav Kanik is a Talmud Mufik and Rav Kanik learned with Rav Dov Schwartz, I think, for 5 years in his share. Rav Dov Schwartzman really was very, very unusual. I mean, I don't think he knew English that well, so basically the share was a Yiddish share, but whatever. So those who understood benefited, and those who didn't understand benefited by being in the proximity of a great man. But he was so involved in learning that sometimes he lost himself. Like I think there was once a siyum, the guys were making a siyum, and he got up to speak about the Maseches, and he went on like for 4 hours. He closed his eyes, he went into a trance, and he just kept on going and going and going and going. I'm not sure who was left when he opened his eyes at the end of 4 hours, but that was Rav Dov Schwartzman. So I'm told that when he was a BACHUR, before he was married, he used to learn 30 hours straight. He would then go for a 50-mile bicycle ride to kind of get himself, energized, rejuvenated, and then he would sleep for 20 hours or something like that. So on the average, he got everything in. On the average, he got his sleep, his learning, and his exercise, but he worked on a different type of schedule than most of us. Now, obviously, the assumption was Hashem blessed him with very good physical constitution as well. I wish I had a definitive answer for you. All I can tell you is that sometimes a person does need to take off. There is no question. You try to push yourself, but there's a saying that the body doesn't lie in some ways. They say you could fool yourself in your mind, but your body will kind of tell you when you just need to take off. And the truth is, the Chavetz Chaim made the point a number of times that when a person pushes himself when he shouldn't be pushing himself, it's really the YETZER HARA that knows that by pushing yourself too much, you're going to get sick, and then you're going to lose all of the learning that you could have done. They say that he used to go into the base medrash of Radin, of the yeshiva in Radin, after midnight, and people were still learning, and he would shut off the lights, and he would put the people to sleep. He would say, because what's going to happen is you're going to learn all night. The next morning you won't be able to daven. You'll get sick, and Lamaisa, the YETZER HARA knows that you're going to do much less learning than you would have done otherwise. So it is a difficult issue. I think the message is we have to push ourselves. For sure, we have to push ourselves. You can't just stop every time you feel a little bit of a discomfort. In fact, it's Baduk U'Menusa. It's a well-known idea that there are times when you're learning that all of a sudden you're seized with exhaustion. Right? You're really, really tired. But if you go for even 5 or 10 minutes and don't succumb, you'll get what's called a second wind. I mean, those things happen. So for sure, you got to challenge yourself, but at the same time, you got to be aware. You have to be aware of what your body needs. And although the ikar in a person is their neshama, not their guf, but our neshama cannot do what it's supposed to do without a guf, and therefore we have to take care of the guf because that is the repository for the neshama. Yeah.
Why do we thank Hashem for the land of Israel when we eat food that is not from the land of Israel? So we say Al Haaretz V'Al Hamazon when we've eaten bread anywhere in the world.
Right. So the question is that the second blessing in Birkas Hamazon, which according to the Gemara was authored by Yehoshua ben Nun, is a special blessing thanking Hashem for a number of things, but predominantly for the blessings of Eretz Yisrael. Now the question is, why would that be relevant to an ordinary benching? Now maybe in Israel, if I'm eating food that is from Israel, so I thank Hashem because it came from Eretz Yisrael. But if I'm eating food that was not grown here, was not made here, maybe I should say, thank you Hashem for Brooklyn, where it makes the best bagels, whatever it would be. Why am I maskir Eretz Yisrael in a Birkas Hamazon for food that may have no shaychus to Eretz Yisrael? Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think the answer is, it reminds me a little bit of a story involving Rav Kook, and you'll see the connection. Rav Kook, some of you might know this, he had already come to Eretz Yisrael from Lithuania, and he was the Rav of Yaffo, which there was no Tel Aviv yet, so Yaffo was the fishing port. And Rav Kook went to Vienna to attend an Aguda, the founding of Agudas Yisrael. And what happened was there was the breakout of World War I, it's 1914, and as a result, travel back to Israel, to Palestine, as it was called, was interdicted. He couldn't get back. Baruch Hashem, he was with his wife and son, but they were stranded. So for 5 years, Rav Kook was separated from Eretz Yisrael. He was in Switzerland for a short time, and then he became a Rav to European immigrants in London, Kahal Machzikei Hadas. And Rav Kook had in his contract, because no one knew when the war would end, and travel would be permitted, that the day that travel is permitted, his contract comes to an end. And he had an absolute guarantee, I leave as soon as I can leave. But he was there for 5 years. And he did a few things. They say he used to go to the British Museum. He liked Rembrandt a lot. He liked Rembrandt's paintings. Rembrandt painted a lot of rabbis, and he said Rembrandt was a guy, but from the way Rembrandt painted rabbis and biblical figures, he saw that Rembrandt had a sensitivity to Kedusha and the like. But when people wanted to take him to see the English countryside, which is very pretty, he didn't want to go. He said, the only beauty I want to see is the beauty of Eretz Yisrael. I don't want to see the beauty of Chutz La'aretz. So he stayed in London, he stayed in an urban area, he didn't want to see the countryside. And maybe there's an idea of the following. I'm eating all of this good food from Borough Park and from Muncie and from Lakewood. And I might be thinking, gee, Borough Park, Muncie, Lakewood, so great, I can have all the kosher food that I want. And then a person thinks less about Eretz Yisrael. So what do I need Eretz Yisrael for? I don't need Eretz Yisrael for all of this food. So I think CHAZAL wanted us to be sensitive, that when we think about the physical pleasures of the world, we should connect it to the pleasures that we would get from Eretz Yisrael, that we should not remove Eretz Yisrael from our consciousness and the like. So that might be similar to Rav Kook not wanting to see the British countryside. Yeah.
So my question is basically about al tikri. Is that first of all, what's the makor for an al tikri? Is it one of the GILGUL, one of the 13 ways to interpret, to make drashas? And secondly, the Gemara on Brachos brings a case, I think a couple of times, of a certain academy that they always would switch the aleph and the ayin. So what's the makor for that in particular?
Yeah. So the question is that CHAZAL often have a drasha that says, al TIKRI, do not read the words this way. Right? For example, every morning we say at the end of davening, Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. Talmidei Chachamim increase peace in the world. Shenemar v'chol banayach limudei Hashem, when your children shall deserve to be learned of Hashem's Torah, v'rov shalom banayach, and your children should have a lot of shalom. So we say, don't read the word banayach. Your children, read it bo nayach, those who build you up. In other words, Talmidei Chachamim. Al Tikri, meaning you're taking the same letters, and since there are no nekudos in Tanakh, So you could vocalize it different ways. Now, this is a little different, by the way. It's very close, but it's not the same. Don't confuse the TIKRI methodology with kesiv and kri. Now, kesiv and kri is sometimes a word is written a certain way, and we are instructed to read it a different way. That is part of the text that Hashem gave Moshe b'Sinai. Hashem told Moshe, write the word this way, and the word should be read this way. Kesiv and kri is mamish halacha l'Moshe miSinai. TIKRI, on the other hand, right, is kind of, you might call it rabbinic imagination, meaning we're kind of making up our own alternative way of reading the words. So the question becomes, where is the source that the Chachamim have the freedom, so to speak, to disregard the vowels and re-vowelize it in a different way? Well, you mentioned, is it found in the 13 midos of Rabbi Yishmael? The answer is no, it's not in the 13 midos of Rabbi Yishmael. But you know, there is a supplementary list. In fact, I was almost on the verge of teaching it in the center last year. I didn't get that far. I think people had battle fatigue from the 13, but maybe we'll go back to the 32. These are the 32 midos of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yossi, regarding Agadata. So Rabbi Yishmael's midos are primarily for halachic determination. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, he didn't make them up, but he codified a list of 32 midos of Agadata, and TIKRI is one of the midos of Agadata. Now, where did he get it from? Right? And I still didn't answer that question. Is that a halacha l'Moshe miSinai as a permissible way of darshaning? Perhaps it is. We don't really know if this is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. I don't mean the specific TIKRI, but I mean the methodology of TIKRI. Or the Chachamim just saw this as one of the mechanisms of the 70 faces of the Torah. So TIKRI is an interesting drasha, but I'll tell you where some TIKRIs are going to give you a lot of problems. And I don't have a complete shot here because I don't have all the examples in my head. A lot of times the TIKRI is a very smooth thing because you're taking the same letters and you're just putting different vowels under them. So you could say, listen, these are the letters of the Torah. You could read it different ways. So we'll call that a straightforward TIKRI. Sometimes the TIKRI changes the word legamri. It'll say, don't read kavurim, read kavutzim. Well, that's a little difficult. There's no tzaddik in the word. So be aware of that. In other words, as you go through Shas and you encounter TIKRIs, note that most of the time the TIKRIs are just changing the vowels. Other times they're actually changing the word. And that's very difficult to understand. Where do you get that from? Where do you get this ability to change a resh into a tzaddik or whatever it is? So those TIKRIs are much more difficult to understand. Yeah.
Is there an idea of, I guess, a pressure valve or an outlet for the YETZER HARA? I mean, I've heard examples of the two threads on the tefillin shel rosh, or the story of a rabbi who wears his kippah a little further back on the head so that the YETZER HARA can bug him about that and not other things. Is this a thing, or what does it mean?
In other words, let me see, make sure I understand your question. Meaning that the YETZER HARA, in other words, you want to try to focus the YETZER HARA to tempt you in some areas that are less important?
It's technically mutter, it's sort of like an imperfect service, but it's not going against it. So it's saying I want the YETZER HARA to bug me about this small thing which isn't really asur. I always thought that the two strings on the shel rosh is meant to do that. It's not perfectly constructed because it's a little bit of a thread sticking out.
Oh, the string sticking out in the front of the shel rosh.
To distract the YETZER HARA from.
Well, I'll tell you, this is an interesting idea. It may have a certain resonance into a famous passage of the Zohar. You know, the Zohar talks about the scapegoat on Yom Kippur. You're familiar with that, right? The Kohen Gadol takes 2 goats on Yom Kippur, and 1 goat is brought as a korban, and it's shechted, and its blood is brought into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That's a holy goat, so to speak. And the other is a goat in which it carries all the sins of Am Yisrael, and it's not a korban. It's taken out of into the desert, and it's thrown over a cliff called the So'ir HaMishaleach, the sent-out goat, or in the language of the Torah, So'ir LaZazel, the goat that is given to the demons. Now, if you read the Torah literally, just without any commentary, it's a very, very disturbing passage. The implication is, on the holiest day of the year, we are offering a sacrifice to the wild demons, whoever they are, that frequent deserted areas like deserts. Well, if that's not avodah zarah, what is it? A service to the demons. That's what Azazel means, the demons of the field. So the Zohar says the following. The Zohar says, this is called a shochad l'satan, a bribe to the Satan. And the Zohar gives an example. Let's imagine that a melech is in his palace and you want to approach the king. But the king is surrounded by guard dogs, vicious guard dogs. How are you going to get by the dogs? So if you're smart, and actually burglars do this all the time, you'll have in your pocket a piece of steak, raw steak, and when the dogs rush you, you throw them the steak, and they get distracted because of the steak, and that allows you to reach the king. Now, a well-trained guard dog actually doesn't get fooled that way, but a normal dog, the meat will be more important than getting you. So the Zohar says the following, on Yom Kippur, we want to get close to Hashem. But there are makatrigim. The Satan is makatreg. The Satan brings up all of our aveiros. So we have to distract the Satan. So we actually give the Satan something to pay him off so he doesn't bother us. Now, this is a very, very deep idea that we don't really understand. But Rav Dessler, this is going to be a long answer to your question. Rav Dessler does give a psychological idea, which is very similar to your idea, and that is, sometimes the best way to fight the YETZER HARA is by making small concessions to it. Because if you try to totally vanquish it, it will rise up with unbelievable fury. So give in a little bit. So an example would be, let's say a person decides that from now on, I'm never going to say Lashon Hara again. I am not going to say Lashon Hara no matter what. You will find that as soon as you make a decision like that, you will have an unbelievable desire to speak Lashon Hara, because your mind will say, I mean, never again? You mean for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, for 40 years? God willing, longer and longer and longer. That's impossible. Just like any enemy. When a person is on the verge of being killed, they're going to fight back with ferocity. If you try to destroy the YETZER HARA, he's going to fight back. So psychologically, the idea of bribing the enemy is, give him a concession. Say, for example, I'm not going to speak Lashon Hara from 2 to 2:30. He'll leave you alone. He doesn't care if you don't speak for a half an hour. What happens is you get stronger after the half an hour, so then you can continue it. So there is an idea, Rav Dessler writes, of sometimes conceding to the YETZER HARA on a minor matter, because then it will fight you with less ferocity than it otherwise would if you were trying to vanquish it legamri. Again, this is an idea that's a little difficult to apply, because we can use it in ways that we abuse it. But there is such a possibility. Although I always think about an opposite approach about smoking. Kirk Douglas, the Hollywood actor who was Jewish, wrote a biography, The Ragman's Son. His father was totally not religious, so Kirk Douglas did not grow up with chinuch. But he tells a story about his father that is mamash remarkable. He said his father was a very, very heavy smoker. And when his father had learned that smoking was not good for health, he just quit cold turkey. And the way he quit was he would keep a cigarette in his front pocket. And every time he had the urge to smoke, he pulled out the cigarette and he said, again, he was not a believer in God. He said, you think you're stronger than me? You think you're going to beat me? I'm stronger than you. Wow. I mean, if he would have been from, what a Baal Musar he would have been. A person with that strength. But Rav Dessler says, for most of us, maybe we have to make concessions, meaning maybe I'll smoke, once a week or whatever it would be, and then we gradually wean ourselves off. So the question you're raising is actually a very controversial question, and that is, should spiritual growth kind of be sudden, like cold turkey, all or nothing? Rav Tzadok seems to suggest that. Just like we left Mitzrayim, we had to leave it immediately. Or do you kind of do things gradually, which is what the Vilna Gaon says. So there are different issues, but the issue that you're raising does have a connection to this idea of shochad l'satan. Yeah.
After doing an AVEIRA, is it healthy to say, to get back up right away and say, okay, I did this, I'm just going to completely move on, not think about it? Or should you kind of have a small moment of wow, I did that?
So, yeah. So the question is, after you do an AVEIRA, is it healthier to kind of just move on? Or should there be some time that you think about in terms of regret? So here's the thing. Obviously, tshuva requires not only fixing your activity, but also regretting what you did. But the question is, when should you do that? Meaning to say, there are those that are going to say, if by focusing on regret or remorse, I'm going to get depressed, I'm going to get despondent, I'm going to get paralyzed, it is better, Rabbeinu Yonah writes, to be oblivious, not to think about the past at all. Just say, okay, what happened is what happened, I'm starting anew. Rabbeinu Yonah writes that the very first step in this type of tshuva is, as the saying goes, today is the first day of the rest of your life. Now, at a point that you then become strong because you've achieved your goal, then you go back and try to regret what you've done. In other words, regret should come after you rectify and not before. But it depends on the person, meaning to say, if you're a person who can get into the idea of regret without it paralyzing you, then it would be a good thing to do. But for many people, it does have a negative effect. So they have to defer it until they're able to confront their past from a place of strength rather than a place of weakness. Yeah.
So BENEVOLENT is coming up, and for most yeshiva, how does a yeshiva student who normally learns GEMARA on a regular basis know? Let's say he has, for example, 7 hours of extra time during BENEVOLENT what should he do with those 7 hours? Should he spend those 7 hours learning GEMARA, or should he spend those 7 hours, which would be enough time to complete a book on building skills on GEMARA? And it would be more beneficial.
Now, your question about how to use your time, did you say it was Bein Hazmanim B'dafka or during this month? What was your?
It could be any time, but I'm just using BENEVOLENT as an example.
Yeah, so Bein Hazmanim, I think, is an easier question. Bein Hazmanim, one should learn. Of course one should learn. Bein Hazmanim is coming up for Pesach. And of course, you have to help your parents and make a Kiddush Hashem. But one should also be very careful to be Kovea Itim LaTorah. It's a well-known idea, and it's a scary idea, that all of the things you accomplished with so much difficulty over a whole year, you can lose in surprisingly fast. You can lose in a week. So, of course, stick to it. But, it doesn't mean it should be the same curriculum as Zman. Bein Hazmanim has its own rhythm. And Bein Hazmanim B'dafka is a time that you should feel free to explore those areas of learning that you generally didn't have that much time during this month. So if you wanted to emphasize Chumash, or Halacha, or Musar, or skills building, or grammar, Diktuk, or Tanakh, it's a perfectly fine thing to do. You don't have to duplicate what the Zman is. That's why there is something called Bein Hazmanim. Bein Hazmanim is not a time that is free from Torah learning, but it's a time in which the nature of your Torah learning can take different forms. Now, if you then ask me the question, okay, I'm not just asking about Bein Hazmanim, where I certainly have that freedom. The Zman itself, how do I allocate my hours in terms of what I should do. Well, number one, if you're in a yeshiva program, you don't have that many free hours. They kind of tell you what you got to do, where you have to be. But to the degree that you do have that freedom, I think the key idea is, CHAZAL tell us, Masha libo chafetz, what you are attracted to, the things that you enjoy. Meaning to say, it's not so much asking somebody else what they think you should learn. It's asking yourself, what is it that I really gravitate towards learning? And that should be your guide, because if Hashem put in your personality a certain desire to learn a certain area, that is what your neshama means. You know, they had an old experiment, I think it goes back to the 1920s, about nutrition. And they pointed out that even little babies will naturally eat a balanced diet over time. Because what they did was, these are like 6-month-old babies. I think today they wouldn't be allowed to do this. I mean, you're experimenting on babies, but they basically took like babies, and they put like, carrots, baby food stuff, carrots, peas, this, that, squash, sweet things. And, the babies didn't eat a balanced meal every day. But like, Monday they ate only bananas. Tuesday they ate only carrots. But it turns out that over a week, they ate a perfectly balanced diet. Meaning if the nutritional options are there, they will gravitate because their body feels, even a baby, their body feels what it needs. It needs that particular nutrient. So what I'm suggesting is that in Torah learning, there's a very, very similar dynamic. If you feel, wow, I just have to learn the book of Shmuel this week, that means there's some nutritional imbalance in you that is satisfied only by the book of Shmuel. You see what I'm saying? This is the yesod of Masha libo chafetz, that Hashem programmed your neshama to kind of understand what it needs at any given moment in time.
My question is really, at what point does someone know? At what point would it be more beneficial for someone to spend this extra time to continue with reviewing Gemara cold turkey to build skills, or should you just, or to read a book on building Gemara skills? Or which point would one be more beneficial than the other?
So you're asking me in terms of skills building, is it more effective to read a book about skills building or by learning Gemara itself? That's an interesting question. Now, obviously, doing it seems to be better than reading about it, right? So the best way to get skills is to do it, right? That's how you do it. It's like reading. Is it better to exercise or read about how exercise improves my cardiovascular system? Well, the answer is it's better to exercise than to read about the benefits of exercise. But I do think there is a value in reading and maybe spending an hour or two reading a book of skills, because that can then focus you on what you should focus on when you actually do it. Again, exercise would be the same analogy. I might want to read a book about exercise so I will understand the best way to exercise. So that's what I would do. So the bulk of my effort would be devoted towards the actual Gemara skills, but I would read a book a little bit in order to understand the best way to approach it. Okay, look at it as a guide. And this is the YETZER sometimes, because sometimes people get so enamored in reading about things that they never get to do the thing itself. And in Judaism, it's much more important to learn Torah than to read about learning Torah, right? So the same thing would be true for that. Yeah.
Nice. Let's say the situation occurs where you have a kid who wants to learn, and or kids joke, we want to learn, they want to go either a first year or TRANSPLANT or HARA as well. Then you have parents who are very against these kids learning or against going to yeshiva. What's the level of yeshiva of an aim that want to with their parents, and how do you go about it, and towards the kid who has to learn?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult question. The question is, you have a child who maybe comes from either a non-Orthodox environment or maybe a modern Orthodox environment, who came to Eretz Yisrael for, let's say, a year after high school, and Baruch Hashem has been growing and steiging, as we say, and wants to say Shana Bet, the second year, and the parents don't want that. They're afraid he'll become too fanatic or whatever it is, and they demand that he comes home. So what's the kid supposed to do? So there is a very interesting disconnect maybe between halacha and practicality that you have to consider. If you're asking me the question, am I halachically obligated to listen to my parents and leave yeshiva? The halacha is 100% you are not halachically obligated to listen to your parents, because kibbud aviyeh never overrides the performance of a mitzvah. Just like if your parent told you to be mechalel Shabbos, you do not listen to him. If your parent told you to leave yeshiva, you don't have to listen to him. And not only that, even if your parent wants you to stay in yeshiva, but wants a different yeshiva, wants you to go to YU or someplace, and you feel you could learn better where you are, halachically, you are allowed to make that decision. Halachically. Now, it is brought down in Sfarim, your parents don't have to pay for it if they disagree with the decision, but that's their thing. Now, the problem is, though, there is a big disconnect practically, and this is where I think sometimes Bachurim, they stop the analysis a little prematurely, meaning they simply ask, halachically, do I have to listen to my parents? And the answer is you don't. But the question is, even if you don't, maybe you should. And you have to look at potential long-term consequences here. What are the consequences that I face if I simply disregard what my parents want me to do? Will they cut me off? Will that destroy our relationship? Because if, indeed, God forbid, it shouldn't, but if God forbid, it would be that catastrophic, that could be devastating in terms of your future learning, in terms of your family life later. So sometimes, even if halacha permits you to make a decision contrary to your parents, sometimes it's better, in the short run, to accommodate your parents. So I'm not giving you a psaka, because every case is going to be different. But sometimes parents can be very, very extreme. They could basically say, I'm going to cut you off. I'm never going to talk to you again. Sometimes they don't mean that. Sometimes they do mean that. That's another thing as well. So all I can say is that by all means you try to enlist the heavy guns. If you have Rabbeim that can talk to your parents, people of influence, maybe the rabbis of your community. If your parents, let's say, they may not want to hear from a yeshiva rabbi here because they figure he's biased. But if they have a rabbi in Great Neck or whatever it is, they'd be more receptive to that. So you try to assemble your best forces and your best arguments. But sometimes you may have to surrender, because the idea is that you're surrendering a battle in order to be able to be victorious in the war. Because this is a longer struggle than simply the next year. Okay, so that's why you need to have a lot of seichel in these matters, yeah.
There a few years ago, the emergence of so-called safe spaces on campuses was called for places where people can go, where they don't have to interact with ideas they don't like, as well as the pejorative that describes these people as snowflakes. They were rightfully ridiculed by many rabbis at Orson and elsewhere. It seems to me, however, that 90% of the HAREDI lifestyle is similarly running away from so-called ideas and technology. What is the chiluk? Is it just we are right and they are wrong? Sure.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. The idea of safe spaces, which created primarily for left-wing people, woke people, whatever, although it's a little before the woke or cancel culture, in which a safe space where I don't have to hear anything defending Trump or whatever it would be. In fact, some of those places even had an emotional connection. They gave hot coffee and hot cocoa and puppies for all people who were traumatized by Trump winning the election in 2016, that people just needed the comfort of a puppy and the like. And, we make fun of that. And Ben Shapiro, I don't know if he coined the phrase snowflake, it's a guy, he kind of uses it for them. So the question that was asked is this. On one hand, we can ridicule that because we make fun of the fact that they're afraid to be confronted with ideas they're not comfortable with. Okay, so now let's look at the Haredi world, in which people are not comfortable with the ideas of the internet or the ideas of secularism and the like, and they create enclaves and they create cultural bastions that are separated from all of those negative influences. Right? Those are the communities that many people try to create. So the question is, that's a very, very good question. The question is, why is that different than the safe space? Why do I ridicule the safe space? And I validate what you might call HAREDI sectarianism, which also tries to separate itself from the secular culture. Now, I do want to say that I think the question is directed to Haredi society. It is not directed to yeshivas in particular, and let me explain why. A yeshiva like Or Somayach in no way can be characterized as a safe space, because indeed, people are free to bring up all sorts of things. In other words, this is not an environment where you're told you can't ask questions. I mean, this thing is called the Q&A, and I'm not the only Q&A here. Rabbi Gottlieb does it, and in other shurim, right? So the question, I think it's important to point out, the question is a very excellent question. It does not pertain to the yeshiva environment per se, but I think it is a fair statement about the overall Haredi community structure that we try to create that is kind of not very open to these outside influences. So why would there be a difference? It is a very good question. The ultimate answer is, as the questioner was Merames, we're right and they're wrong. And that is that when you have a Torah, when you have mitzvos, when you have directions from God as to how you're supposed to live your life, it makes sense that you try to distance yourself from things that will take you away from your mission. But in the case of political and social ideals, which are not, etched in stone, and they were not given by God at Sinai, why should a person be afraid of debate and discussion, right? So I think that's the difference. The difference is that insularity is much more defensible. Now, I'm not saying I support it, by the way. I'm just explaining that shita. Insularity is much more defensible in protection of divine ideas than they are in terms of secular ideas. I mean, after all, the United States as a country was founded on the notion that through political free speech, you get to the truth. I mean, that's why there is the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? The Congress shall make no law limiting freedom of the press or freedom of speech, without getting into all of the ramifications in which you have 200 years of Supreme Court interpretations. But the yesod of the First Amendment is that truth emerges from considering conflicting viewpoints. And by the way, in Torah, that's very much the same too, within parameters. In other words, we're not going to debate, is Torah from God? But machlokas, but the whole structure of GEMARA is you come to truth by looking at different views. So it actually is a very similar modality to the dialectic tension of the First Amendment. So that's why I think that the safe space thing is kind of ridiculed, because it's essentially, it's almost fascism. It's essentially basically saying that there's only one truth in the political and social realm, and we are not tolerant of anything that does not comply with that truth. And that's something that's very, very wrong. Yeah.
This is ascendant, actually. If a BACHUR is leaving Yisrael, it's the end of his man, and he has an option on his final night before he has to go catch his flight to attend his regularly scheduled night seder or go down Marv at the KOTEL one last time. Which is preferable, and does it make a difference if his chavrusa for his regular night seder is already going to be gone?
Wow, that's an interesting question. A person has his last night in Eretz Yisrael. He's going back to Chutz La'aretz. Should he go to his regular night seder, or should he go to the KOTEL to DAVEN Ma'ariv? And is there a difference if the chavrusa already left or didn't already leave? This is a very, very hard question. In theory, in pure theory, your night seder is more important than going to the KOTEL. Because going to the KOTEL gives you an emotional high, etc., but it's not the same chashivas as the regular day-to-day grind that you have to do, and that would even be true. That would even be true if your chavrusa is not there. Now that's in theory. I do think, I may get in trouble here, because I think that the standard answer your Rebbe will give you is go to night seder. I think. I don't want to say for sure. So I hate to say things that the Rebbeim might disagree with me. But I'm a soft touch in that way, because I think that we need sometimes emotional chizuk as well as the intellectual and spiritual joy of Torah learning. And if going to the kotel will elevate you and make you feel a certain passion and yearning and longing to be with God, I think it is worthwhile on your last night to do it. But again, it depends. It depends. Because not everybody has this experience at the kotel. You know, we commonly say, oh, the kotel, the kotel, the kotel. You know, okay, the kotel is the holiest place that we're allowed to go to. You know, beyond the HARA is holier, but, you know, we generally don't go there. But, you know, not everybody has, unfortunately. We don't always have a deep spiritual experience at the kotel. Sometimes there's a carnival atmosphere. So many different types of people are doing different types of things. So you have to be honest with yourself. I mean, if you're telling me I'm going to go to the kotel and I'm going to cry to HaShem for 2 hours, that's one thing. If I'm going to go to the kotel for 15 minutes and then go to the pizza places in the old city, that's a different type of situation. So I think you have to be honest in terms of how are you going to use that experience. But if you're going to use the experience in a meaningful way, I think it would override even the regular night Seder. Yeah.
If someone has a deadly peanut allergy, is currently in Israel, which is rampant with peanuts everywhere. Let's say he doesn't have an EpiPen on him.
Well.
Is he allowed to go to a first aid kit and take an EpiPen for himself to keep it in case he has a reaction? A, if there's only one EpiPen in the kit, and B, if there are 2 EpiPens.
I'm sorry, taking it from a kit that's where?
From a first aid kit that's either in a restaurant or a public place or wherever.
I see.
Anywhere that's around.
Yeah, so the question is that there are people who have peanut allergies, and Israel is not a peanut-free country. Bamba is the most popular food, even more than falafel in Israel and the like. And sometimes a person goes into anaphylactic shock, God forbid, they could die, and they need to inject themselves with an EpiPen right away, right, these things. And let's say the guy doesn't have an EpiPen, but he could filch an EpiPen, so to speak. He could steal it from a first aid kit as he's going through. Would he be allowed to do that? And is there a difference in a situation where this is the only EpiPen in the kit, or there are 2 EpiPens, so there'll still be an EpiPen for somebody else? You know, it's a very excellent question. I think there's a serious issue here. At least if there's only one pen, for sure there's a serious issue, because it's true that you may need the pen to save your life. But it's also true that if you're taking the only pen, you might be endangering somebody else who needs the pen as well. So the general principle that you don't save your life at the expense of endangering somebody else's life would indicate that you would not be allowed to take the pen. Now, if there are 2 pens, I think there's more of a justification, because the likelihood that 2 people will need the same kit is very, very remote. I don't think you have to assume that, well, what if 2 people need it and the like. But so I would differentiate indeed between 1 kit and 2 kit. Now the other issue, though, I'm sorry, 1 EpiPen and 2 EpiPens. But one issue, maybe I don't know enough about peanut allergies. Can the allergies be triggered in ways other than eating? Like if it's in the air, can that?
Depends on the person. For some people, it can go into anaphylaxis just by smelling it. Some people have to either touch it or eat.
Yes, I would differentiate, meaning to say if it's a type of situation where he only gets affected by touching or eating, I think the achrayus is on him to be very careful. He just has to be very careful. And I wouldn't justify taking an EpiPen just in case he's not careful. Even what?
Even if there's 2?
Even if there's 2, I think so. If, on the other hand, you're talking about a person can be vulnerable by airborne particles over which he has really no control at all, then I would give the heter for that. So I think there's an issue here. One interesting question one has to raise, just nothing to do with your question per se, is has there been a growth in tree nut allergies, or not nut allergies generally, peanuts or even tree nuts? Because people of my age say, hey, when we were kids, we didn't seem to notice these things. So is that true or is that not true? Maybe things were just not noticed, but they were there. I don't know. You know any research on the topic that why there seems to be greater nut sensitivities than there used to be, the good old days? Yeah.
In Yitzchak, if a person is not ready to face the idea of bringing children into the world, having a kid of his own, for all the many reasons, the world seems like a very dark place. He's just not at the level of Botton to trust that, it's the best thing for the kid, or just he's not ready to face the responsibility, the day-to-day responsibilities of dealing with the kid, or for whatever the many reasons are why someone might not be ready. Do we tell that person he could or should still get married if he's ready to, if he's not ready to then immediately have kids?
Yeah, very interesting question. There are people who are not psychologically ready to have children, and that's a reality. Meaning, it's not that they're shirking their duty, but they're really not ready. And in fact, we would advise them not to have kids. So the question is, if you're not ready to have kids, does that mean you're not ready to get married and you shouldn't get married? Or do we say that getting married is an independently valuable thing, even if it'll mean you'll be on contraception for a while and not have children? It is an excellent question. I think at the end of the day, marriage is considered to be valuable. If the person's ready for marriage, that's the assumption. If a person is emotionally ready for marriage, but is not yet able to handle children, I would not use that as a deferral of marriage. I would basically say, get married, and then discuss with the rabbi or discuss the needs for contraception for whatever period of time. Because look at it this way. There's no mila in not getting married over getting married and using contraception, because if you're not getting married, you're not having kids either. So it's not like not getting married is an improvement of legabe pru or vu over the other thing, right? So I would say getting married is good, and getting married can stabilize a person. And we often talk about the negative part. Oh, marriage is such a stress and everything else. And okay, we need to be aware of the problems in a marriage. But, if it's a good marriage, it's kind of the opposite, right? It should be something that can create a more stabilizing environment, a happier environment. And it could help a person eventually come to a place where they're able to have children. The one thing in which I would clearly do it, I would not push a person to have kids before they're ready. I would not tell a person, you have to have kids because of pru or vu. To tell people who are not ready to be parents that they must be parents according to halacha is a recipe for disaster. You just don't do it. It's wrong. On the other hand, we do have to differentiate between people who are really not ready versus people that have cold feet or are nervous. A lot of times, you could talk to a person and let them understand that God will give them the wherewithal. But if somebody really, really is not ready, it would be a crime against their children to tell them they have to procreate at this point. Yeah.
And just this is kind of in a similar vein, moving on from somebody who's not ready to have kids to somebody who is not yet emotionally or just in life is still working on it, growing, and is not at a point where he's ready to look for a shidduch and go get married. But oftentimes, I think most young men, there's a reason why marriage is an important thing. It completes a person. It gives him a soulmate. It fulfills a lot of loneliness and a lot of holes that a single person probably feels. How do we tell a young man who realizes he's not ready to get married now, but feels all that loneliness or those holes? How does he deal with that?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult issue. CHAZAL optimally encouraged young marriages. That was clearly the case. CHAZAL say a man should get married at 18, and girls commonly got married, when they were 12 or even younger than 12. So young marriages were the norm, and young marriages were the expectation. Today, we would not encourage, for most people, young marriages, because we're not emotionally mature yet, and we need time to develop. But that creates a problem, because the emotions might be underdeveloped, but the sexual urges and the psychological needs are very, very intense. So in a sense, we kind of have a double whammy, the worst of all situations in which you can't get married because you're not ready, but you can't have a close relationship with a woman because you're not married. How can you have a close relationship with a woman? And at a time when there's, and I know you're talking more than just the physical, I don't mean to say so, but there's raging hormones and there's emotional needs and all of that, and there's no way you can satisfy it. Now again, I want you to realize, historically that had not been a problem, because when we lived in a society, when people got married young, there was no problem. By the time you had all of those needs, you were able to satisfy them in different ways. So it's really very, very, very difficult. I don't have a great answer for that. In the modern Orthodox world, well, modern Orthodox world, they don't automatically keep the halachas. But the interesting question would be, again, I'm going to get in big trouble here, is there the possibility of Platonic, heterosexual, halachically compliant relationships? To put it in regular English, can I have a girlfriend as long as I don't do, improper negia and yichud? But I have a girlfriend. I have a girl that I can talk to. I feel comfortable talking to the girlfriend. Now, the standard yeshivish response is, under no circumstances can we allow that, because you're going to break the boundaries. And okay, and I hear that, because these sexual urges are very powerful. On the other hand, in individual cases, sometimes that may be, it's not a complete solution, obviously, but sometimes that may be the necessary accommodation that we make to at least the person has. Now again, you can say, well, what's the purpose of having a girlfriend if all I do is talk to her? Well, okay. But many people find, for whatever reason, that they can feel closer to a opposite gender than to another man, or whatever it would be. So I'm equivocating here. I'm not giving you a definite answer. But I think we have to acknowledge, and again, and I feel validated a little bit, because I believe, I don't remember the exact stories, but I believe I saw some story with Rav Steinman in which a kid had a girlfriend, and Rav Steinman said, how can you take the girlfriend away from him? That's the only thing he has in his life. How can you take it away? Meaning there was a recognition that sometimes that's what a person needs. Now again, I want to emphasize, I am not at all advocating breaking halachos. We're not talking about that. But on the level of social friendship, it may be something that's necessary. But it's a very, very difficult situation, 100%. Yeah.
What is the earliest source for an antidote or a specific example of GILGUL reincarnation? And what is the earliest source where GILGUL is stated as something that happens to most of us?
Yeah, so the idea of GILGUL, reincarnation, reincarnation is not mentioned directly in Tanakh or Mishnah or Gemara, either Bavli or Yerushalmi. GILGUL is mentioned in Zohar, and how early that is depends on the gigantic controversy of how old is the Zohar. Meaning the traditional understanding is that the Zohar dates, or at least much of the Zohar dates, from the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which would place it in the 1st century, shortly after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So that would make it very early. On the other hand, there is the opinion of Rav Yaakov Emden that the Zohar gets pushed forward to the 1200s, Rav Moshe Di Leon. So whether the Zohar is early GILGUL or later GILGUL depends on the dating of the Zohar itself. But other than the Zohar, the earliest mention that I'm familiar with is Ramban in his commentary to the book of Iyov, where the book of Iyov deals with the whole issue of why do righteous people suffer, and the Ramban understands that the solution might be connected to GILGUL. You're getting punished for past sins. Now, the idea that everybody comes back as a GILGUL, almost everybody comes back, we're not here the first time around, this idea is primarily from the Arizal and his Talmud Rav Chaim Vital, which you're talking about the 1500s already. And Rav Chaim Vital wrote the definitive book on Gilgul based on the Ari's teachings. It is called Shar HaGilgulim, in which he goes through great detail the notion of Gilgul. The book is available even on translation on Chabad.org. You can actually look at Shar HaGilgulim, Chabad.org, although they don't really explain it that well, but they translate it. Now, I've said before that there is at least one great authority who rejects the idea of Gilgul Bichlal, and that's Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th century, the 900s, in his Sefer Amunos Videos, which is really the first systematic book on Jewish philosophy, does acknowledge that many people believe in reincarnation, but he says it is a non-Jewish idea that God adapted erroneously within the Jewish people. So there's really a big diversity of opinion here, ranging from Rav Chaim Vital, that almost looks at it like an article of faith, to Rav Sadia Gaon, that says it's a non-Jewish idea that's not true. So that would be it. So I would have to say that certainly by the 16th century, Gilgul became a very well-established notion in Judaism. Yeah.
What qualifications does a person need to meet to know that he's ready to get married?
Yeah, what qualifications does a person need to know to determine that they're ready to get married? That's a good one. I think the idea would simply be a few things. Number one, do you get along with people? If you don't get along with people, you're probably not ready to get married because, your wife will be a person you have to get along with. Number two, are you flexible? Are you a person that's accommodating? In other words, do things have to always be your way? Or do you understand the idea of compromise and working together? In some ways, now again, a wife is not a roommate, obviously it's so, but in some ways, the difficulties of dormitory life, which can be difficult sometimes, can be somewhat of a preparation for marriage, in which you have to share a space with other people, and you have to learn to accommodate and to give in, and when to assert yourself, and when to not assert yourself. So I would say you need flexibility, you need a sense of kindness, the ability to care for other people, the ability not to be consumed by your egotism, and the like. Now, none of us are going to be totally perfect in those areas. We're all going to have problems in those areas, but at least you see that you're working towards improvement in those areas, and that'll tell you that you're kind of ready to be married. I would also add that another indicator of ready to be married is you feel a sense of incompleteness. In other words, once again, your neshama is telling you this is what you need. Just like the baby knows when it has to eat peas, when you feel incomplete, in a sense, that's kind of the sign that you're ready to get married. Yeah.
So I have a lot of non-Jewish friends coming from my background.
Yeah.
Coming into this environment, there's a lot of talk of separating the Jew and the non-Jewish person.
Yeah.
And going back into that world, or at least trying to integrate it when I have a lot of non-Jewish friends. How am I supposed to interact with non-Jewish people, knowing that there's this boundary, this separation?
Yeah, so the question is, a person has a lot of non-Jewish friends from their prior life. They come to yeshiva, they learn about the uniqueness of the Jewish people. Sometimes they learn negative descriptions of non-Jews, although I mentioned earlier that should not be a predominant focus. And the question is that I leave yeshiva, I go back to my old environment, how do I relate to my non-Jewish friends? A very, very good question. But let me point out something. I'm not sure if the primary issue is Jew versus non-Jew as opposed to different value systems, meaning I could raise the same question, and maybe it's even worse question, not vis-a-vis my non-Jewish friends, but vis-a-vis my Jewish friends who don't care about Torah, don't care about mitzvahs, because that's essentially the problem here. And this is a difficult issue. On one hand, I am not in favor of cutting off friendships. People that you care about, you should continue to care about. But the problem is, and it's always said, and it happens in many areas of life, that you grow apart. Your lives move in different directions, and you don't see the world in the same way. So you can't always expect that you're going to be able to replicate that same level of closeness. So I'm not saying you cut off contact, make believe they don't exist. But I think emotionally, you'll see that you've moved in different directions. So we can't connect the same way that we connected. So you try to figure out ways of connecting that don't involve those types of conflicts, but it may not be the same intimacy or the same intensity. That's always a sad thing. That is sad in life. But as they say, it's not even unique to a religious experience. You'll just something, you may have a good friend that you remember from 7th grade. I mean, you really loved each other. And then you see each other like 20 years. Now, sometimes it'll be, it's like we never separated. Sometimes there is that experience. And sometimes you kind of say, well, we're just different. It's not the same anymore. And it is sad, but that's what life is sometimes. Yeah.
Given someone who has a Torah and Tefillah Seder as well?
I'm sorry, someone that has a?
Given someone that has a Torah and Tefillah Seder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether they're in a yeshiva or whether they're in a working day, so whether they're doing it all day or whether they're doing it part day. When they're outside of the framework of either Tefillah or Somayach, how are we to understand this idea? Where do we draw the line where talking, having a conversation is actually Talmud Torah, and where our actions, what we're doing is actually an act of tefillah or gemilut chasadim. What specifically tefillah?
Yeah.
Not with another person, gemilut chasadim, but tefillah like self-growth and like connection to Hashem.
Yeah, so the question is, let's say a person is in the working world, or a person is not full-time yeshiva learning.
Or even if they're in, even if they're in a yeshiva, but between classes, like where they're like, so to speak, not like this is a Torah statement.
Right. So the question becomes, when I'm learning, when I'm davening, so I know I'm serving God, but what is my connection to Hashem when I'm off duty, so to speak? Whether it's in my working environment, where I'm on duty for work, but not for the avodas Hashem, or bein hastorim. So this is a very, very crucial point. In reality, one has to understand that you are on duty 24/7. You're serving Hashem all the time. You're serving Hashem when you're learning. You're serving Hashem when you're davening. You're also serving Hashem when you're working. To work, for example, would be you would consciously think, in what way can I sanctify God's name? I'll be nice. I'll say good morning to the secretary and smile. To the janitors, so they'll look at me and say, oh, religious Jew, nice guy. I will be honest in my work. I will be conscientious in doing my job. And think about this consciously. In other words, almost every hour, tell yourself, like a prayer, may my work be pleasing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Same thing when you take a break. Bein hastorim. Even though you're not there yet, you can't really say you mean it. Like you might say, sometimes people eat food on Shabbos and they say for every spoonful, l'chavod Shabbos Kodesh. So I have to admit, I always thought that was a little pretentious, meaning you're only eating the cholent, l'chavod Shabbos Kodesh? Or are you eating cholent because you like cholent? Like, what are you making this statement, l'chavod Shabbos Kodesh? But in truth, there is a certain notion that even if you're faking it, at least you're identifying in your mind what a goal should be. In fact, Rabbi Victor Miller has a beautiful essay about the importance of being fake. Yeah, it is controversial, which means, you fake it. You walk outside and you're really tired. I mean, I know this, and somebody goes over that you don't really want to see. So you'd rather just get out of there as soon as you can. He says, if you can fake it and say, Shalom Aleichem, it's so good to see you, that's a monumental spiritual accomplishment, even though that's not reflecting your heart at all. But eventually, the chitzonius is mashpia on the panemius. So I think a person should take time, periodically, in the workday, or bein hastorim. I'm eating to be able to feel better to serve Hashem. I'm sleeping, I'm jogging. And therefore, the Rambam writes, everything you do then becomes part of avodas Hashem. your basketball games and your jogging and your eating ice cream, all of that is serving Hashem. So conscious awareness is the best way to do that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah.
First off, thank you. How do we understand that our conversation breaks the rule of just a regular conversation becomes Torah? It used to be the oral Torah.
Well, listen. The more you can make your conversation regular Torah, the better it is. So I think you need to consciously try that. Meaning, if you could sneak in Torah thoughts, that's a wonderful thing. Yeah. Just last question, because I have to go to Myra downstairs. Yeah.
And so, this is like a common question that people have, and recently I was talking with someone, he's an atheist, because obviously I think they said, like, if something really bad happens, he gave an example of an earthquake or something, he says, like, well, if this was a human that did this, you'd say this person is evil, and thinking about this, like, it doesn't prove that there's no God, so there's many other options. Like, you could say, if someone's polytheist or dualist, they could say, well, there's an evil God and a good God. And as in Christianity kind of mixes the two, which would be the most problematic, where they say there's an evil force, but then there's an all-powerful God, so then it would seem like it would never happen. But in Judaism, we believe that there's one source for everything.
Yeah.
So how do we explain this when someone says this? Is it untrue to say that God is also evil? Like, that is not something you can...
Yeah, so again, I'm going to have to hold off on this, and maybe next week we'll talk about it more. But the short answer is, this was what Moshe Rabbeinu asked God. Moshe Rabbeinu asked God, why do righteous people suffer in the world? Why is a good, compassionate God allowing bad things to happen? And God essentially answered, I'm not giving you the answer to that. That is indeed considered to be the mystery of the book of Job. And Mr. Shem, I'll be willing to talk more about it next week. Okay, take care.